Well, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. And thank you for joining us today for our FutureFeed Explorers Series webinar entitled Managing Scope, Identifying and Limiting Your CUI Boundary. Today's webinar is being recorded and all attendees will receive an email with a link to that recording. You can also enter questions into the platform and we'll try to answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation. We will send a separate email with answers to any questions we aren't able to get to. Today's webinar is sponsored by FutureFeed and by Peak Compliance. FutureFeed is the leading cyber GRC platform for the defense industrial base. And at FutureFeed, we're committed to securing our nation's supply chain from our adversaries by creating an affordable, collaborative IT management platform. Peak Compliance provides expert CMMC consulting and coaching services, leveraging their proprietary CMMC acceleration framework, which is fully integrated with the FutureFeed compliance tracker. Their streamlined approach simplifies implementation of NIST 800-171 and positions clients to confidently secure defense contracts. Well, the FutureFeed Explorers webinar series was created to arm defense contractors with the information you need to understand and address the requirements of CMMC. And throughout the series, we're going to share critical insights from industry experts and best practices for achieving and sustaining CMMC compliance. Equally important, we're going to share the why behind the CMMC program and its requirements. While the focus of organizations is on receiving a CMMC certification, the real objective must be ensuring their ability to protect the sensitive information with which they are entrusted and the information they create. CMMC can't be approached as a checkbox exercise. It needs to be viewed as a corporate and as an individual responsibility to secure our nation's supply chain from our adversaries. Today's webinar explores the first step in the CMMC journey, identifying and managing scope. Well, my name is Stuart Itken. I am CRO and Chief Security Evangelist at FutureFeed. Much of my career has centered on supply chain and vendor risk management and regulatory compliance. I formerly served as a member of the CMMC Standards Working Group and participated in the establishment of the CMMC accreditation body, what is now the Cyber AB. I'm a founding member of MSPs for the Protection of Critical Infrastructure and a director of the CMMC Industry Standards Council. Joining me today are Rachel Leidy and Nancy Laney. Rachel Leidy is Director of Compliance Education at FutureFeed and is an experienced cybersecurity professional with over 15 years experience implementing and assessing frameworks, including NIST SP 800-171 and NIST SP 853. Rachel is a CISP, a certified CMMC assessor, and a certified CMMC professional. And her background spans service in the U.S. Navy and direct support of the DoD. And Rachel really brings a unique and very real-world perspective to cybersecurity and compliance. And Nancy Laney, Nancy is president and owner of Peak Compliance in Southern Oregon. And with over 30 years of expertise in compliance design and implementation, Nancy's passion is bringing compliance realization within reach of the small to medium-sized businesses in the defense industrial base. Nancy's mission is to make the complex understandable and distill experience-based best practices possibilities to precisely what is needed for small to medium-sized defense contractors. So Rachel and Nancy, thank you for joining us today. Well, as I said, today's webinar is about scope. And scope, according to our friends at Merriam-Webster, is defined as the subject matter or the things that are relevant. In our case, it's the things that are relevant to CMMC. So think of it as there being a box, and what's inside the box are the things that need to be protected, the things that are capable of storing, processing, or transmitting CUI or FCI. CMMC is about ensuring that the things inside the box are protected. But we not only need to know what's inside the box, we also need to know and understand what's protecting what's inside the box. And finally, we need to know what's outside the box. We need to make sure the box is as small as possible without leaving anything outside the box that belongs inside the box. That said, We also need to be concerned about the things outside the box. And while they may not be subject to CMMC, some things like IoT and IoT devices and operational technologies such as industrial robots should be and need to be protected. But scope is important because it identifies what needs to be protected and ultimately what needs to be assessed. And scoping, as I said earlier, is really step one on your CMMC journey. And getting it right, getting off on the right foot is important. And we'll explain how you get off on the right foot in detail later. What scope identifies are the assets. The assets are the people, the processes, the systems, the locations, or the facilities in which CUI and FCI is stored, in which it is processed, and from where it is transmitted. And all of these assets must meet the applicable requirements. We're not going to get into those requirements today, but they also need to be identified, characterized, inventoried, and documented. And as I said, our focus today isn't explaining on how these assets must be protected or other requirements. That's going to be the subject of future webinars. Today, we'll simply focus on what they are, not how they need to be protected. And one last point, CMMC requirements for protecting both FCI and CUI exist. In many organizations, the scope for FCI and the scope for CUI, where each is stored, processed, and transmitted, can be very different. And this has implications, again, for your preparation and also for your assessments. So kind of with that, I mean, Rachel, I mentioned that people, processes, systems, and locations are all assets within CMMC, but how are these assets categorized?
Great question, Stuart. Nancy is going to be running through an exercise on scoping an environment. I just want to briefly talk about what is asset categorization and why we need to do it. So when we talk about categorizing assets, we're not just checking a box. We're really laying the foundation for everything that comes next in your compliance process, to include implementing the security controls appropriately within your environment and preparing for that assessment. So by clearly categorizing your assets, you get to define which ones need to meet the security requirements in NIST 800-171 and how they're going to be evaluated and handled during your CMMC assessment. This helps us make sure that the system security plan that we're developing and maintaining along the way is accurate and aligns with the IT products, the technology, the assets that we have inside the environment. It also allows assessors to focus their efforts on the right systems and ask the right questions during their assessment without any surprises. So categorization, it's not just for assessment purposes. It's really for you and identifying where the security control requirements need to be implemented to appropriately protect the data you're responsible for protecting. So as Stuart said, we're not going to get into the different asset categories, but I am going to highlight here in the next 3 slides that there are different asset categorizations for each CMMC level. For an FCI environment, you have 3 asset categories. And it does call out specialized assets. I just want to highlight a little bit how the asset categorization can change with regards to what needs to be implemented in these systems and how they're going to be handled during an assessment. So at a level 1 FCI environment, specialized assets will not be evaluated, which is true for a level 2 environment. However, an assessor will look at your system security plan, next slide please, to identify how the security control requirements, what security control requirements you have in place for these specialized assets. Additionally, in a level 2 environment, we have an asset category, contractor risk managed assets, CRMAs. These are assets that can store, process, or transmit sensitive information, but are not will not store, process, or transmit this sensitive information due to company policies and procedures in place. So they don't need to be physically or logically separated. And if appropriately documented within your system security plan, will not be evaluated. That is different than when you move into a level 3 assessment, where the CMMC program has done away with the contractor risk managed asset CRMA asset categorization for level 3. Those assets are now considered CUI assets, as highlighted on the slide, and will be evaluated against all level 2 and level 3 requirements. Next, Nancy will be running through her recommended approach for conducting scoping.
Right.
Hey, thank you, Rachel. You bet. So we're going to walk through a scoping exercise for a small organization, medium-sized organization, and we're going to go through this in 8 steps. So the first step for an organization, and let's assume that it's a manufacturing facility that has some commercial business and some federal contracts. And as we go through this, we'll look at all of those different types of scenarios. So the very first step we want to do is look at the contracts that we have. So as an organization, you're going to want to look at any of your contracts that are federal, or perhaps you might have flow down contracts from a prime. And you're going to look for the clauses in your contracts. For the FAR clause 52.204-21, that's going to indicate you have federal contract information, or FCI, and you need to apply those 15 basic security controls to everything in that, as Rachel just talked about, the different categories. The second portion that you want to look at is if you have any controlled unclassified information, or CUI, or also sometimes called CUI. You're going to be looking for clauses that are the DFARS clauses 252.204-7012 and 7019. And those clauses are going to indicate that you're required to protect controlled unclassified information with the NIST 800, 171, 110 basic controls. And you have to apply those 110 controls to everything that's in scope. So the very first step, like I said, is identifying what FCI and what CUI you have in your environment. So the second step that we're going to do is we're going to look at our subcontractors. In the performance of your contract, do you have subcontractors that are providing components or materials that you're using? Do you flow down federal contract information to those, or CUI, in order for them to provide the components? If you do, you need to include those clauses and those requirements in those contracts with your flow down to your subcontractors. So that's step number 2. Now, as we look at step number 3, we want to look at, and we're going to start with just FCI. We're going to keep it simple. We're going to start with identifying FCI in your facilities, and also where does that FCI data live? Where is it stored? And so perhaps you have 1 or 2 facilities. Maybe you just have a headquarters, but if you have 2 locations, you need to look in all of your facilities. And then you need to start identifying the technology where that FCI data lives. And that federal contract information could be any information about the performance of that contract. It could be contract information, it could be project information, it could be technical information. So you need to also look in your email, your Exchange, your cloud. If you have Microsoft, for example, maybe you have data in Azure. So you're going to want to be looking at all of those places. Perhaps you have data stored in Teams or SharePoint and Word and Excel files. All of that's going to be part of your scope. Now, as we move on to step number 4, we're going to start looking at your users that are authorized to access FCI. And we're going to look at what technology they're using to access that and process it. Now, in our drawing here, you can see that we have FCI users indicated in blue, but perhaps you have commercial line of business that doesn't have federal contract information. So those users are not authorized to access FCI. So those would be out of scope, and we would separate and track those separately. So then as we go on to step number 5, what we're going to be doing is looking at all the other things that are connected to our network. So what does that mean? It could be manufacturing equipment. Perhaps you have industrial equipment as part of your your production line. Perhaps you have security cameras on your facility and they're plugged into your network. That's part of what you need to inventory and identify. Temperature monitors, maybe you have 3D printers. Perhaps you have government issued equipment. So that would also be included in this inventory. So all of those different types of assets, if it's plugged into your network or wirelessly connected, you need to identify and inventory all of those components. Now, as we look at step number 6, what we're going to do is look at all of the equipment on our network. So we're going to look at our firewall, for example. Do we have guest Wi-Fi and do we have internal Wi-Fi? Do we have Active Directory for on-prem or do we just have Active Directory in Azure? Do we have switches and routers and little managed hubs on our network? All of those things have to be inventoried and documented in our inventory for our network. So then as we look at step number 7, we've pretty much identified all the assets, we've identified the people, but we haven't looked at external providers yet. So we really have to look at what other resources where we could have federal contract information stored. So for example, we might have a home user and they might be accessing federal contract information on their laptop from home through a VPN connection. We might also have our ERP, which we're using to manage our operations, and we might have federal contract information in that. We could have other external service providers. We could have cloud apps that HR uses, for example. There's any number of cloud applications that we need to consider when we're doing our inventory. We don't want to leave those out. And then again, we want to inventory any of our subs and then document those and include them. The other thing that we want to mention here is if you have a managed service provider or an external IT provider who's providing services for your environment, you're also going to want to inventory them and look at what information they have access to and what services they're providing your organization. So now when we move to step number 8, what we do is we're going to map the data flows. And this is going to help validate that we've identified all of the assets and resources and users and technology that are used to transmit, store, or process FCI. Now, as we go to the next slide, we're going to do a little practice exercise here with categorizing these. And Rachel, would you walk us through that?
Sure. Stuart, you might have to push the over button a few times to get my categorization colors to pop up. But all we're trying to depict here is that within an FCI level 1 assessment scope, there are 3 categories. After you identify and inventory all your assets, which again include people, technology, and places, the next step is to categorize them according to the 3 categories displayed on the screen. So this isn't just a technical exercise. It's going to require a clear understanding of each asset's role and responsibility in relation to the sensitive data you're trying to protect. To do this effectively, you'll need to collaborate closely with the individuals utilizing those assets or responsible for managing those assets, whether that's your department leads, system owners, or facility managers. You're going to want to have a good understanding on how that asset is interacting with the sensitive data you're trying to protect. Categorization is only meaningful when it reflects how assets actually interact with the sensitive data. So the categorization step lays the groundwork for defining your security boundary and determining where you need to apply the security controls that protect that data. So in an FCI environment, you will identify the assets that store, process, or transmit FCI. These are your in-scope assets, and need to implement the 17 level 1 NIST 800-171 controls. You'll also identify the assets that can process, store, or transmit FCI, but are unable to be fully secured. You're unable to fully implement all of the NIST 800-171 security controls on them. These are your specialized assets. And then lastly, you're going to identify the out of scope assets. These are assets that do not store, process, or transmit FCI and are unable to due to physical and or logical separation.
All right, thanks, Rachel. That was really helpful. All right, so as we move through this exercise, we're now going to look at level 2 scoping. So if you have controlled unclassified information in your contracts and in your organization, we're going to really identify that by the 7012 clause in your contracts. And so everything goes back to those contracts, and those requirements are spelled out. If you have a 7012 contract, and I see that question in the chat, that specifies that you're required to implement NIST 800-171 and apply it to your CUI scope in your environment. So the next step, once we've identified those contracts and what CUI is in our organization, the next thing you're going to want to do is inventory users that are authorized to access CUI and what devices are they using. And this is going to be real similar to what we did for level 1, but now we're looking at users that are restricted and specifically authorized for level 2 for CUI. So once we've identified those users, we're also going to be looking at where is that data stored? Is it, if you want to go ahead and advance, Stuart. Yep, is it stored in our facilities? Do we have it on an on-prem server, or do we have it in multiple facilities? And then next we're going to want to look and see where we have FCI stored in email and in our Microsoft environment, if you have that, for example. Now, pro tip here, if you have CUI, you're required to store it in Microsoft GCC, which is a government cloud computing version. You're not allowed to store that in commercial because that does not apply the appropriate security controls on the back end. GCC does only have data centers on US soil, which is one of the requirements. So once we've identified if we have CUI stored in our Teams or our SharePoint environment, then we're also going to want to be looking at the IoT or manufacturing or specialized assets in our environment that may have access to CUI. And then, of course, we're going to be looking and evaluating which part of our network gear also is processing or transmitting CUI. So if we have a firewall, most likely you're going to have CUI passing through that, perhaps unencrypted. So that would be another item to be looking at. So once we've done that, we need to then also look at all of those external providers and external connections that we might have. So that's our ERP, for example. Now, understand that if you have an ERP that's in the cloud, it is required to be FedRAMP moderate in order to securely store and protect CUI. So you can go to the FedRAMP marketplace to see if your ERP is FedRAMP moderate. Then we're also going to want to look at other cloud apps and other external providers. So your MSP, for example, do they have access to your CUI and process and store that? We're also going to want to look at home users. Do any of your home users have access to CUI? All of these things become in scope if they have access to process, store, or transmit CUI. So now that we've identified all the different places CUI is, on the next slide, we see that we're going to start locating them here, and then we're going to go into the next logical step, which is going to be doing the data flow diagram. So now we're going to be processing and tracing out all the places where CUI is accessed, where is it being processed, where is that data flowing in your organization or out of your organization. So this is where it becomes really important to understand all the different ways it enters your organization. How do you process it and store it? What systems is it in? What users are authorized to access it? And then how is it leaving your organization? And each of those are critical components to defining your scope. So then as we move on, we're going to practice categorizing these. And we have a lot more categories to do this time, don't we, Rachel?
We do. There are now 5 categories to consider when categorizing your assets for a level 2 CUI environment. So again, we've identified and inventoried the assets, and we've defined the CUI flow throughout the environment. Next is to categorize. Proper categorization Again, it just doesn't tell you what is in scope of your assessment. It's going to help you identify what doesn't need to be inside your environment. Once you understand each asset's role and the relationship to the sensitive data it is storing, processing, or transmitting or protecting, you can look for opportunities to remove assets outside of that compliance boundary, outside of that assessment scope, reducing implementation costs, compliance efforts, overall risks. Categorization is a powerful way to reduce the size of your boundary. Once you have a solid understanding on how the assets are interacting with that data, anything that doesn't need to interact with that data, you might want to consider logically and physically separating it from the CUI environment, from your assessment scope, reducing the need to implement those requirements. So for a level 2, you have your CUI assets. These are assets that directly store, process, or transmit CUI data. Then you have security protection assets. These are assets that are offering protection to or implementing protection on the CUI assets. You also have the specialized assets. These are assets that can store, process, or transmit CUI, but you are unable to implement the full set of security control requirements on these assets due to technical limitations. Then you have CRMAs, contractor risk managed assets. These are assets that can store, process, or transmit CUI, but are not intended to. And your company would need to show policies or procedures that are restricting those assets from directly storing, processing, or transmitting CUI. But those assets do not need to be logically or physically separated. Then the last categorization is out of scope assets. So these are assets that are not directly storing, processing, or transmitting CUI. They're not providing protection to CUI assets, and they are logically and physically separated from those assets that are in scope.
And Rachel, I know we said at the beginning we wanted to ensure that all of the things that need to be in the box, that need to be protected, are in the box. But can't an exercise like this, also help you identify things potentially that you'd put in the box that don't need to be put in the box, to essentially kind of reduce the cost and effort required to be able to address the CMMC requirements?
Yes. Yep.
Well, good. And I know, when we started out, I said we want to make scope as small as possible. And by reducing scope, there's just less to protect. Ultimately, it should take us less time. It should be less costly to protect an environment that is just, smaller, and cost less, take less time to bring it into compliance. In some cases, scope just can't be reduced. A small contractor that works exclusively with the DoD, either as a prime or as a sub, is likely to be a case in point. Their facility, their information technology, the cloud service they use, the people are all likely to be in scope. But if we look at another example, let's say a commercial business for whom 5% or 10% of its business is DoD related, excuse me, it may find it beneficial to separate those assets, kind of separate the facilities, the people, the processes in the IT from the main business. Now, at the IT level, separation is achieved through what we call isolation, and that can be accomplished logically through such things as role-based access control, or through network segmentation, which divides a network into multiple subnets. Each acts as its own network. And we can also achieve isolation physically through such things as enclave, essentially setting up a separate or a new IT environment and performing the DoD contract work in a separate secured physical environment. Though that environment can be within the larger environment, it just needs to be secured. But separating assets may also require changes to business process. And this is really important. If a commercial business and the DoD business use the same customer support process today, separation may require creating a new process for DoD related work. And it comes down to recognizing two points that I have found very helpful in scoping. I mean, one, business processes determine where CUI exists, and business processes may need to be changed to isolate CUI. And second, need to recognize that IT exists to enable those processes to function. And so that if you change the processes, you may need to change the IT. And isolation or segmentation really needs to start by reviewing, often making changes to business processes if you're looking to be able to reduce scope. But with that, Nancy, I know companies' efforts to categorize assets and to establish what's in scope and what's not, sometimes they get it wrong. And how typically can somebody get scoping wrong, and what are the consequences when they do get it wrong?
Stuart, that is a fantastic question. So let's walk through a few examples here of where CUI could be hiding in your organization that may not be obvious. So number one, perhaps you have a user who is authorized to access CUI, but they're doing it on their smartphone, but that's not an authorized device. You might have an unauthorized device then in your environment. Another example would be a home user, for example. What if you have a home user with an authorized laptop through a VPN connection, but they decide they need to print some CUI at home, so they connect to their home network and use their home printer. You now are pulling in their entire home network, the printer, and their home office into scope, and that would require the appropriate controls to be applied to that from a physical analogical perspective. Another example would be a subcontractor who you are flowing down CUI, that's controlled technical information, or covered defense information, either one fall under CUI. And if you're flowing down that covered technical information to a subcontractor and they are not implementing the NIST 800-171, they don't have the security controls in place, now you're responsible because you flowed that down and you're liable for the risk of that organization. Another example where you might not realize CUI is, what if you have an engineering team and they're using a cloud-based 3D CAD program as part of their design process, but that wasn't identified in your scope, and now they're putting CUI in this cloud app and it's not FedRAMP. That's another example where you could have a fail if you're going through an assessment and that's identified. A couple more examples include, and some of these are not really obvious. For example, what if your executive is using outside counsel, an attorney, to review contracts? And part of that contract includes performance data from prior contracts that contain CUI. Now, is that attorney, do they have a NIST 800-171 secure environment to hold that CUI? You might need to come up with a different workflow rather than emailing or sharing that data to an outside counsel who doesn't have the security controls in place. Another example that, and as I work through these examples, you can see how it pops up in many different ways. And so really understanding what these users' workflow is and how they're using the data and what they're doing with it really can drive where that CUI is living, which may not be obvious on the surface. For example, here's another example. What if you have CUI stored in a CUI server? It has the appropriate controls, it's in your CUI enclave, everything's good. But what happens if your Veeam backup server is out of scope and you're backing up that CUI data to your Veeam backup server, which is outside your CUI boundary? These are just certain, some simple examples of where you could have CUI living outside your scope. And it takes a bit of work to really identify all these data flows, but it's really critical that you do that.
And I mean, I'm sure that the consequences of getting this wrong can be fairly significant. I mean, it's got to be more that, gee, if I left an asset off of my inventory, just kind of adding it to to the inventory. Rachel, can you elaborate a little bit more on the consequences of getting scope wrong and maybe share with us an example?
Sure. And I'm going to be speaking mostly from the assessor point of view, but I do want to plug that the more important issue here is protecting your CUI data. And if you have an asset that you did not previously identify as in scope of the compliance, you may not have implemented the appropriate security controls on that asset to protect that data. From an assessor's point of view, I'm going to share with you a situation that I ran into when I had done a JSVA assessment. And it's similar to that last example that Nancy had given us, where we met with the organization, and during our pre-assessment phase, we met with them to discuss scope, and they presented their system security plan, their scope diagrams, their CUI flow diagrams. We had an hour and a half, almost 2-hour discussion about the different assets that are in scope, as well as the assets they have identified as out of scope and why they said they were out of scope. Well, fast forward to day 3 or 4 of that assessment, I'm interviewing a system administrator, and we're talking about data encryption and encrypting CUI at rest. During my interview, the system administrator mentioned that the CUI database is being backed up to a different facility owned by that company, a different domain owned by that company, and that was a huge red flag for us. None of the assessment team was tracking this other CUI database in a different location and even a different domain. While we were in day 3, day 4 of the assessment. So what that meant is all of those technical controls that we had evaluated in days 1, 2, and 3, we did not have the time to go back and reevaluate if those technical controls were being implemented on that asset in that other domain, which led to multiple assessment objective failures, multiple control failures. Not only was their system security plan inaccurate because it did not address how those controls were implemented on that other asset, we didn't have the time to evaluate them. So that was a JSVA assessment. We made a determination to continue with the assessment. Their score was impacted greatly because of this finding. During a CMMC assessment with a C3PAO, potentially you could look at a complete halt to the assessment and not continuing. So a lot of trickle down of just mentioning that one asset, and all of a sudden we've gone from on track, things are going well, to now we have 20, 30 controls that have failed.
And Rachel, it's probably not just the assessment. I mean, I think it's almost a case of a stitch in time saves 9, so to speak. What would you imagine that it took that organization in terms of time and cost to be able to go back and really correct that, and to be able to appropriately deal with that particular asset to ensure it met the requirements that applied?
Oh yeah, a lot of rework, many hours of rework, essentially reevaluating almost all of the security controls that get implemented on a database, reworking their system security plan documentation, reworking their policies and procedures to include that asset and managing the assets on that other domain. Even their physical access security plan for their facility, they did not have anything for that other facility. So many hours of control, reevaluation, and implementation to get back up to that compliant state.
Right. So it really does emphasize, why when taking this first step in setting scope, getting it right really is so important to do this. And I know that we covered a lot of things, here, and people are likely not to remember everything that we've talked about. And Nancy, are there any tools available that can help people through the scoping process that you had described?
Stuart, you ask a fantastic question. So one of the things that we help our clients do is we provide a workbook for them to go through and start inventorying all of their assets, documenting their data flows, and starting to identify authorized users and processes. And I'm willing to make that available. We can share that. I can share that to you, Stuart, and you guys can send that out in a link. This also includes a scoping question. One of the things we found is that many organizations, and I see this question in the chat, many organizations struggle to understand, what does FCI look like in my organization and what does CUI actually look like? And so those are key questions. And so there's some information in there to kind of help you discern, what does that look like in your organization? A couple of other resources is the FedRAMP Marketplace. If you have CUI and you're storing it in a cloud, you need to go to the FedRAMP Marketplace and validate that those cloud apps are FedRAMP moderate. And the marketplace tells you all the applications that have passed and the ones that are in process trying to get certified. Another tool I want to mention is FutureFeed. Not to plug FutureFeed, but to plug FutureFeed. They are a fantastic resource for inventorying and categorizing all of your assets. They have a great tool where you can add in all of your inventories, your assets, you can track them, and you can apply POAM items to them, and it allows you the opportunity to manage those assets and have visibility into them, and then quickly be able to pull those into your SSP, and you don't have to redocument them. It also helps you make sure you don't have any gaps when you're doing your SSP, because if you've put everything in there, you've got a good solid inventory that helps build your SSP from the ground up. And Rachel, I think you had a blog here talking about that.
Yes, for the FutureFeed users who've joined today's session, I just wanted to point out that we recently produced a how-to guide addressing how to document your assessment scope in FutureFeed. So feel free to scan that QR code, or we will also be sharing the link after today's session.
And I think one other thing, we'll share the link in the email that we sent as a result of this. We've mentioned some things like FCI, CUI. There have been some questions that have come in relative to just helping define those. We published a book called the CMMC Everything book, which is available for download, which goes into a lot of detail explaining some of those concepts. Again, ensuring that we can arm you with the information that you need to be able to successfully address the requirements of CMMC. Rachel, like, kind of moving on, I know that, companies, they're kind of living, breathing things. They add people, they lose people, they buy other companies, they get bought, they introduce new business applications, they add new cloud services. Why is it important to continuously monitor and manage scope? And why is it important to lock in scope and manage changes as they occur?
Good question. So we'll start by defining what we mean when we say lock in your scope. When we say lock in, what we're essentially meaning is that your CMMC assessment scope defines that environment that went through that assessment, went through that certification assessment, and was authorized to store, process, or transmit CUI data. It is the only environment in your company authorized to process that data. And locking it in means committing to that boundary for the duration of your certification, for your certificate, or if you do need to change your boundary, add new systems, add new capabilities, then you're potentially looking at a recertification. So locking in your scope, essentially, we're just saying, have a good understanding of that environment that was assessed, the environment that is tied to your certification, and monitor and plan for any major changes that would expand or change that scope accordingly. Maybe even aligning those major changes with that 3-year cycle for your assessment, so you could prevent having to be reassessed in the middle of that 3-year cycle. So the type of changes that could warrant a recertification or a reassessment, I've highlighted some here in this slide. When we talk about changes to your environment, not all of them require a reassessment, but some absolutely do, okay? If you're just patching your systems, upgrading OSs, some of those things may not warrant reassessment. This slide highlights some of the changes that would impact your scope. I derive this information from the CMMC program 32 CFR Part 170. Anytime you're expanding your network, adding new locations, onboarding external service providers, migrating to a different cloud platform. You're potentially introducing new systems that handle CUI, which brings them into your compliance boundary, right? Because you want to protect that information. Similarly, major infrastructure upgrades, mergers, and even the introduction of new workflows where CUI is created and shared can shift the landscape of your assessment scope. So the key takeaway here is that if the change affects how or where CUI is handled, it's likely a scope change that would need to be evaluated, and you would need to determine if a reassessment should be initiated.
And I just add to that, I mean, that in other frameworks, that there are such concepts as significant changes and when something needs to be rescoped. I don't think that's been fully defined yet for CMMC. Has it, Rachel, what a significant change exactly is and exactly when a recertification may be required?
There's not too much information on it. There's some language in the CMMC program. So what we've done is we've looked at other mature frameworks like your risk management framework, ISO, and see how they're handling these type of changes.
Right.
Handling and defining major changes, I should say. All right, so you're going to want to monitor for these changes. Once you understand the type of changes to be monitoring for, the type of changes that can impact your scope, the next step is making sure you monitor for them. I like to sometimes tie certain security control requirements with the facts that I'm throwing out, as I did in this slide. So all I'm trying to show is that you should be monitoring for changes not only for reassessment, recertification purposes or scope changes, but also because there are security requirements within the NIST 171 that require that activity. This slide is outlining the key ways to stay ahead of scope creep. Start by establishing a change control process that flags potential scope impacting events like new systems or service providers. Make sure those changes go through a formal security review before being deployed in your production environment. Ensure there's ongoing communication, effective communication between your IT department and your compliance department, who really understands that assessment scope, your compliance boundary. These groups need to work together to catch changes early, especially ones that could bring in new assets into your compliance boundary. Additionally, review your network diagrams and data flows at least once a year. If you are in the habit of reviewing your system security plan annually, awesome. You should be reviewing your CUI data flows and the associated assessment scope, compliance boundary diagrams. Anytime there's a major update, you should be reviewing this documentation as well as updating that documentation. And as a part of your annual assessment required in the CA 312 family, conduct a formal review to check whether your scope has shifted or if things have remained the same. The final takeaway here is that CMMC and your certification, your assessment, is a snapshot in time. If your assessment scope changes and you don't account for it, your security posture and your certification can become invalid.
And I think that's really an important point. It kind of comes back to, again, why we're doing this. And while there is such a focus on getting the CMMC certification at level 1 or level 2, again, the real reason that we're doing this is to ensure the security of the DoD's supply chain and ensuring that we are able to individually and collectively handle that responsibility our businesses have to protect the information with which we've been entrusted. If scope changes, more important that you're ensuring that the proper protection is being applied to those things that change within your scope. Isn't that right, Rachel?
That's exactly right, Stuart. Sorry, I had to get off mute.
Alrighty. Well, I know we've covered a lot of information in the last 50-ish minutes or so. There have been questions about availability of the slides, availability of the webinar replay. We will be sending out a link, or an email which has links to those, links to some of the other resources that we described, including the tools that Nancy mentioned a little bit earlier. So we've received a lot of questions during the webinar. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can, but we will send a separate email with the questions and the answers that we're not able to get to today. And just to summarize a few key points, scope involves more than IT. It is the people, it's the processes, it's the systems and the locations in which CUI is stored, processed, or transmitted. Second, scope also includes assets other than those that store, process, or transmit CUI. We need to be aware of the assets that protect CUI, the security protection assets. We need to be aware of the assets that are capable of storing, processing, or transmitting CUI, but don't, the contractor risk managed assets, as well as the specialized assets, things like IoT devices, like process control systems, things that really need to be protected, but are not included within the scope of CMMC. Next, the scope for FCI that you handle may be different, and in many cases is different from the scope of CUI you handle, and a single level 2 assessment of your CUI environment may really not be sufficient. And scope in some cases can be reduced, and that should be considered. And finally, scope will change as your business changes. Changes in scope need to be managed, as Rachel indicated. But again, remember the objective. Again, this is not about checking a box. It's about ensuring you're protecting the sensitive information with which you're entrusted. Again, I mentioned the resources that we'll be following on, or that we'll be sending in an email. We'll also be including my email address, Rachel's email address, Nancy's email address. Please consider us as resources if you have questions specific to your organization or about CMMC. We're happy to be able to support you on your journey to ensure that we're all successful in helping secure the supply chain to the DoD. And also look for future episodes of the FutureFeed Explorers series as we address other issues, all intended to be able to arm you with the information and the tools you need to be able to succeed in your CMMC journey.